Well, good evening. I'm in 2 Peter chapter 2. Love to have you join me there. Did you listen while Denny was reading? Well, that was just a terrible description, wasn't it? I mean, there's people out there like wells without water. Now, that's kind of pointless, isn't it? Kind of like clouds just being driven around by storms, but just clouds just up there for no reason. I mean, when they talk, their mouths are filled with foolishness. They blow up their ears in order to be able to hear more. You know, they get this big ear syndrome so that they hear what all's going on and so that they can spread it, you know, and they make all these promises and they're false. They have no background. They have no substance. They did know the way of truth, but man, they've left it. And where they are now is worse than, was you listening to Denny read about, man, it's just awful. I mean, it's just ugly. I mean, they'd been better to have never known the way. It'd just been better for them to have just been ignorant of the way of righteousness altogether, because the last state of them is worse than the first. Let me describe it to you like this, and I haven't eaten supper, and I don't like it any better than you do, but it says what it says in verse 22. It's like a dog going back to vomit. It's like a pig going back to the mud after she was cleaned up. Who in the world are we talking? This is awful stuff. It's just, let me tell you something. 2 Peter chapter 2. Let me describe to you a little bit more. Go back to verse 10. Listen to them this way. And especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passions. They despise authority. They're bold. They're willful. They do not tremble. They blaspheme themselves as glorious ones. They're self-willed. Go to verse 2. They have sensuality, and because of them the way of the truth will be blasphemy. Verse 18 that Denny read, they're filled with sensual passions. They're following the flesh. They're living in error. Go back to verse 3, and they're full of greed. The words they speak are false. Verse 14, their eyes are full of adultery. I wished I could make this say some things better, but it says what it says, and I'm just reading it to you. They're full of adultery. Their eyes, verse 14. They cannot be satisfied with sin. That's pretty descriptive, isn't it? They are unsatisfiable. Even in sin, they can't get enough of it. Verse 14. They are constantly enticing those who are not steady. They are constantly luring souls who are not founded, who are not anchored. They are training them in greed. They are forsaking, verse 15, the right way. They're going astray. Who in the world are we talking about? Who is Peter describing in some very descriptive and awful terminology here? And the answer is found in verse 1. False prophets and false teachers. If I were to put a heading on 2 Peter chapter 2, and remember last Sunday night, I told you we was going to have to cover a chapter at a time, and so we don't have time to dig into every verse and every word of this short epistle. But if I was going to just put an umbrella heading on chapter 2, it'd be this. Beware, beware. Why? Because there are false prophets and there are false teachers. You see, this whole chapter describes those that Peter introduces us to in verse 1. And immediately we began to think, well, yeah, there are false prophets. There are false teachers in our world today. But I want you to catch what Peter says in verse 1, among you. And we're not talking about everybody else. We're talking about among you. There are wolves in sheep's clothing. Ain't that how Jesus described them? In Matthew chapter 7, beware. Beware. There are wolves in sheep's clothing. False prophets, false teachers. Thomas B. Warren said one time that to the average man, one religion is as good as another. To the scholar, one religion has as many faults as another. To the politician, one religion is just as useful as another. After all I want is your vote. And so what happens is, according to Brother Warren, is that the Word of God becomes like taffy in our hands. And unfortunately, and I'm still quoting him, unfortunately, some have taken the taffy and perverted it and twisted it to fulfill their own selfish, sinful desires. End quote. Now think about what he said. To the average person, to your average coworker, to your normal classmate in school, to the person you see in Walmart that you stand in line with, at the grocery store, that you're standing across from at the gas pump. To the average person, one religion just as good as another. But in reality, what we know is that there are some who have arisen and could be even among the Lord's church. Peter says, among you, that have perverted and twisted the gospel in order to satisfy. I don't know how you get any more graphic than some of these details here. I mean, when you think about the setup of these false teachers and false prophets, at the end of verse 1, they're bringing destruction. They're denying the master. Verse 2, they're following their own sensuality. In other words, it has no substance. It's just about what makes me feel good. And because of them, the truth is blasphemy. They're exploiting people, verse 3, with false words. Their condemnation is long. It is not idle. Their destruction is not asleep. In other words, it's very real. It's very common. It's very lengthy. These false prophets and false teachers. But in the same way, what they're doing is so powerful. Because they're perverting, twisting, changing, leaving out, omitting, adding to, in order to create a religion that appeals to my senses and my flesh. So Peter says, beginning in verse 4, you remember the angels in heaven? Do you remember some angels in heaven who decided to disobey God, to deny the Master, to follow their own sensual passions? You remember what God did with them? He cast them into hell, bound by the chains and the darkness and the gloom, among which was Satan himself. Let me ask you something. If God is willing to take the very angelical created beings that chose to disobey and cast them out of heaven, what do you think He's going to do with these false prophets and false teachers? Peter doesn't stop there. He goes on in verse 5. He says, you remember a time when the ancient world was flooded? When Noah and his family were preserved. But God destroyed the entire universe of people, of humanity. And all of the animals save those that were on the ark. Why? Because man was wicked. Man was consumed with evil thoughts and false teachers and false prophets. People were believing one lie after another, spreading one lie after another. God became angry, and He flooded the world. He promised He wasn't going to flood it again. I understand, but do you remember a time when God's wrath was so enraged that He only saved one family of humanity? How about Sodom and Gomorrah? How many examples do you need? You remember Lot? How about Lot's wife? You remember how God rescued Lot from the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? You remember what they were engaged in? Do you remember the bargaining that Abraham tried to do to get God to let him go find some righteous people? God says, that's fine, Abraham. You go down there, and if you find, well, we got down to 10, didn't we? You find 10, I'll be satisfied with that. You ain't going to find them. I'm not even sure Miss Lot was among the righteous. Maybe Lot was the only one. Maybe his daughters. God completely, utterly destroyed those cities. Why? Because of wickedness. Because of evil. Because of sinfulness. He sums all that up in verse 9 by saying, let's just make this simple and let's just make this clear. Be advised, God knows how to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. Example after example. One was good enough, but He gave us 3 examples to remind us. Remember what Peter said back there in chapter 1. I want to remind you. I want to stir you. I want to keep this in front of you. Example after example of those who are like the false prophets. Waterless wells. Clouds without rain. Promising things that they can't provide, verse 19. Who have results like this, verse 20. After they have escaped the defilement of the world. Now, I realize that there are many passages throughout Scripture that would help us to understand it, and this is the only false doctrine that I think I'm going to bring up tonight, although I could bring up many. There is a very, very popular doctrine out there today that says, once you're saved, you're always saved. My friends, 2 Peter 2, verses 20 through 22, shoot that doctrine to pieces. If this is all I had, if I only had these 3 verses, and I'm telling you, they're not the only ones. If you were here yesterday for Men's Day, B.J. Clark talked about another one that causes that doctrine to crumble. Listen to verse 20 again. For if after they have escaped the defilements of the world. We're talking about false prophets and false teachers that have arisen from among the Christian family. How do I know that? Well, because Peter makes it very clear, they've escaped the defilement of the world. They've come out of the world. They have had a time in their lives when they were no longer slaves to the world. You remember Paul talking about that in Romans chapter 6. And he says in verse 16 of Romans 6, you can be a slave to unrighteousness. But they have come out of that. They're no longer defiled by the world. They're no longer entangled by the world. They're no longer enslaved by the world. They've come out of that. They've been freed from that. Another way we could say that is they've been saved. They've been saved from the corruption of sin. But, according to verse 20, they are again entangled in them and overcome by them. They have come out, but according to verse 20, they have chosen to go back in. They have chosen to allow themselves to be overcome, to be entangled, to be enslaved by the world, to be captured by sin again. And the word again is significant for me because verse 20 tells me that they were there, they came out of it, now they've gone back into it. If I'm going somewhere for the first time, I do not say, we're going again. But if we were to load up and go to Disney World tonight, then I would be forced to say, we're going again. Because it's somewhere we have been. They have been there. They have been entangled by the world, but they have been removed from it and have chosen to go back into it, to the point that Peter makes it very clear the last state is worse than the first state. The first state being back there when they were defiled by the world and didn't know it. Now, through knowledge of Jesus Christ, they have come out of it for a time, but have chosen to go back into it. Who? False teachers, false prophets. He says in verse 21, it'd been better for them to have never known it, that is the way of righteousness, than having known it, to turn back, to turn away, to give up the holy commandments delivered to them. They were among the saved, and they chose rather to be defiled again by the world. That's the results of false teaching, false prophets. And it shoots down, it tears down, it destroys the false doctrine of once saved, always saved. If I were to ask you tonight to take out a piece of paper and just list for me some doctrines in our world today that are not scriptural, I'm convinced that every one of us in this room could do that. And as you look at that list of things, be it 2 or 3, be it half a dozen, be it a dozen, I would then inquire of you to consider the origin, the beginning, the motivation behind that particular doctrine. Where did it come from? If we are claiming that it is not scriptural, then where did it come from? Why does it exist? And what is it that you and I need to remember? Let me give you a few things to remember, and then the lesson's yours. Number one, remember there's a difference between truth and opinion. Read the first 3 verses of 2 Peter chapter 2. There is a difference between truth and opinion. And far too often what happens, as you and I look down our list of false doctrines, far too often what happens is truth and opinion get confused, even get reversed sometimes, to where an opinion becomes truth, at least as it's perceived and taught. And so what is presented as truth is actually just an opinion. And it might be an opinion of a group of people, but at the end of the day, it's still an opinion. There is a difference between truth and opinions, and we need to remember that and keep those two separate. Is it okay for me to have some opinions? So I hope so. I've got a few. Do you? But do I recognize that regardless of what makes me feel good or what pushes my sensual buttons, if it ain't truth, it ain't truth. And I can't make it truth just because I like it. And according to my opinion, it would be better than the truth. The second thing we need to remember tonight is that back here in the beginning of this book, there is page after page after page after page that we call the Old Testament. As kindly as I know how, brethren, we need to be studying that part of the Bible. I learned more from the Old Testament yesterday than I've learned in a long time, and my eyes were open. There's a lot of things in that old Bible that I haven't read, or if I had, I guess I have, I just forgot it. Paul said in Romans 15 and verse 4 that the things written before were written for our learning, for our instruction. As Peter goes back here in 2 Peter chapter 2, he goes back to the Old Testament, and he says, you remember the angels being cast out? Do you remember Noah? Do you remember Sodom and Gomorrah? You remember Lot? Old Testament. We need to remember there's a lot to be learned and to be gained from studying the Old Testament. I think tonight, number 3, I would caution you to remember that hell is real. I don't know what it is about. I don't know if it's Hollywood. I don't know if it's this whole love movement. I don't really know what's going on in our culture today as far as this. But it's almost like we want to delete hell. Just wipe it out. Dissolve it completely. It's almost like, God is a God of love, and that's absolutely true. The Bible says that. And because God is a God of love, He would never send anybody to a place that's described like hell. And maybe right the opposite's the truth. What do you think? If He would send, did you hear verse 4? If He would cast angels, I don't think I'm going to take a higher seat than an angel. If I disobey, I think God's going to send me right where I belong to go. Right where I deserve to spend eternity. If I act like the false teachers and the false prophets, following the passions of the flesh and fulfilling the sensual desires and the greed and the adultery that their eyes were filled with, and if I find myself living a life that can't even be satisfied with sin, I just want more and more of it that is sin, and I believe with all my heart God will send me right where I deserve to go. Hell is real. Read verse 9 again. God knows how to hold those for punishment. It's just and it's fair. But don't forget tonight, we need to be reminding people, we need to caution people, hell is a real place. I was going to suggest to you a fourth thing to remember tonight from 2 Peter chapter 2 is it's this. Sin hardens hearts. Sin hardens hearts. Verse 14, their eyes are full. Their lives are not satisfied. Their desire is to entice others. Their hearts are trained. They are training their hearts, accursed children. Sin hardens hearts. Sin causes us to become callous. It causes us, I always think about the little boy that was fishing with baby rattlesnakes. I always think about that story. And when that first one bit him when he reached into the jar, it just stung like crazy. But by the time he reached in 3 or 4 more times, His body was so filled with venom, he was numb, and he didn't even feel it. Now, that's how sin works, isn't it? Sin hardens hearts. And unfortunately, when we believe lies and when we buy into lies and when we adopt and accept and give credit to false religion and false doctrines, then over time that will callous us to what the truth is. If I was going to caution us tonight from chapter 2, I would say, beware of this. Remember, there is a right way. Remember, there's a right way. Thus implying there's a wrong way, right? You got to be careful with this one, because I know what Proverbs 14 and verse 12 says. And I know what Proverbs 16 and verse 25 says. There is a way that seems right unto man, but the end, Proverbs 14, is death. But the final toll, Proverbs 16, is destruction. So you got to be careful that what I feel like is the right way is not my way, but God's way. 2 Peter chapter 2 makes it very clear there is a right way. There is a proper way for you and I to live and to be able to escape the error of sin and the destruction and the defilement. And then, if I was going to say we need to remember something, my last one would be that you can fall away. He who thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. I marvel that you so quickly have perverted the gospel and started teaching another gospel as though there was another gospel. If anyone teaches anything other than that which you have received from us, let him be accursed. I tell you again, if anyone, even us, teach anything other than what has been received from heaven, let him be accursed. As faithful as we are tonight, Mr. Clark talked about it yesterday in his last session. We all stand the possibility of falling away. Don't ever forget that. There is that potential there, and we, like the dog or the pig, can return to the devastation and destruction and heartache and misery and defilement of the world. To become enslaved again by the world. But you don't understand, preacher. I go to church on Sunday night, and my response would be, you're exactly the one the devil's looking for. I mean, look around. If somebody didn't come tonight because they just didn't want to come, Satan's not looking for them. He knows right where they are. He's looking for you. Preacher, you don't understand. I come to church on Wednesday night. And what I'm learning as I get older and older is that some of Satan's greatest grounds for hearts is Wednesday night services. That's the ones he wants. Don't ever think. God help us to never think that we can never fall, because we certainly can. And some have, and some will. And you may be among that group. What a blessing it is tonight. And God says, I still want you. But before you come back, you need to realize and you need to resolve to participate in that no longer. That lifestyle's got to go away. You can't continue to live like these false prophets that are described and false teachers in 2 Peter chapter 2. You're going to have to give up the world. Give up the defilements. Give up the entanglement to sin and desire to walk the right way. If you're walking the right way tonight, keep walking. Don't take your eyes off the cross. And don't ever forget that with every step, Satan is daring to trip you. He's begging to trip you up. Don't let him. Stay strong. Stay firm. Stay faithful. But if that's not you tonight, the invitation's yours. Would you come as we stand and sing?